What I want to share with you in this project is my own heart for the dignity of women. And I want to begin in this session by sharing how this has come about. One of the greatest causes of poverty in the world is a lie. Poverty is rooted not in lack of money or material things. Poverty is rooted in lies. And one of the greatest causes of poverty in the world is the lie that men are superior to women. My journey began in 1980. I was in Flagstaff, Arizona. I was the leader of a student union at the university, Northern Arizona University, and I was driving down the street of Flagstaff one day, and I was happened to be listening to a pastor teaching from Genesis 2. And he posed the question, how is it that a man and a woman, two people, could come together and be one? And he said the answer to that question is when one of the two becomes a zero. And that shocked me. It made me want to vomit to hear a pastor say that. And that became the beginning of this 35-year journey. The next part of this occurred in the late 1980s. I had been going to Korea 2 or 3 times a year to train young people who wanted to work among the poor in developing countries. And the second time I went to Korea, I had a young woman come up to me and she said, "Darrow, can I talk to you?" And I said, "Yes, what would you like to talk about?" And she said, "I have a problem. My boyfriend has proposed that we get married, and I don't know what to do." And I asked her, do you love him? And she said, "Yes." "Does he love you?" "Yes." "Are you both believers?" "Yes." "Well, what's the problem?" And she began to cry. And she began to tell me the story of her father and her mother, and how her father, a Korean man, treated her mother, how he talked to her, how he physically abused her, how he emotionally abused her. And it came to a point in her life where she could not stand it any longer, and so she committed suicide. And she said, "I'm afraid. I'm afraid because in Korea, when men get married, they change. They become something different." And she introduced the concept of namjam yobi to me. This is a Korean phrase, and it means men are high and women are low. And when you grow up in a Korean household, you hear this phrase, namjam yobi, every day. You hear it from your parents, from your siblings. And as you grow up, you understand that the man is more important than the woman. And in fact, in Korean culture, when a man and a woman get married, they don't separate into their own household. The young bride moves into her husband's parents' household and virtually becomes a slave, a servant in that household. So she was afraid. She was afraid of what would happen when she got married. And that was really the beginning of my listening as I traveled around the world. I worked for a nonprofit organization called Food for the Hungry, and I've had years of traveling globally, hearing the stories of women, hearing their suffering, their abuse. I've wept with them, and at a moment in time, I was confronted with the fact that I need to do something about what I'm hearing. There's a saying in Korea, it's an old Korean proverb that complements namjam yobi, says dried fish and women both are better after they've been beaten. And you hear things like this. I've heard things like this as I've traveled all over the world. I remember being in Rwanda in Africa, and somebody said, after I'd been talking about the dignity of women, someone said, well, here in Africa we have a saying, real men beat their wives. And that was like a stab in my heart. Then one year I was flying to Korea to do a conference for about 650 young Korean college-age students. And as I was flying to Korea, I was reading an international newspaper, reading the story titled, "A Korean Woman Still Feels a Demand to Bear a Son." And the story was the story of a young Korean woman, Lee Young-soon. And she was a young mother. She'd had a baby daughter. And she was pregnant again and went to the doctor to confirm her pregnancy and to find out what the sex of the child was. And she found out that she was carrying another baby girl. And she went home and she asked her husband, would you like to have another baby? And he said, yes. And she said, well, would you like to have a baby girl? And he said, no. So you'd want to have a baby boy? He said, yes. So this young mother went out and aborted her baby girl, simply because she was female. And the story went on to talk about how in Korea at this time there were 30,000 fewer girls being born every year than they should be. They were killed by sex selection abortion before they could see the light of day. 1 in 12 baby Korean girls were aborted because of Namjam Yobi. Every year, 116 boys were born for every 100 girls. And at this moment in history, this was the second highest ratio of boys to girls other than China. China had the same concept that male children are better than female children. So in China at that time there were over 118 boys for every 100 girls. When I was in Korea with these 850, 860 Korean university students, every day I would lecture, and then we had a little box where people would give their questions, and I'd look at the questions in the evening, and the next morning before we'd begin the lectures I would answer their questions. And probably a quarter, maybe a third of all the questions related to the relationship between men and women in Korea. What do you think about Korean men? What do you think about Korean marriage? How do you look at the way men treat women in Korea? Probably 25 or 30% of the questions were related to issues of men and women. And then I remember distinctly it was a Wednesday night, and the staff of this organization that had invited me to come wanted to have a staff birthday party. And they had 40 staff people, and we were sitting around Korean style on the floor of a large room. And before we were going to have the birthday cake, they wanted to have a time of question and answers. And I'll never forget the first question. A young Korean woman stood up, and before she asked the question, she said, "I hate being a woman in Korea." And again, my heart was stabbed. How could this young woman be so traumatized simply because she was a woman in Korean society that before she asked a question, that this statement just came out of her mouth. She sat down, and I have to tell you, I didn't even hear the question. I was so stunned by what she said. And so I asked her, can you tell me why you hate being a woman in Korea? And she began to cry. And she began to tell her story. And very shortly, all the women in the room were crying. And when she was finished, another woman began to share. And then another woman shared. And I watched the Korean men as they were hearing these stories. Real stories about their life in Korea, about things that are going on but no one ever talks about. And I watched the men, and the more they heard, the lower their heads got, the more shame they had at what they were hearing. And after about 45 minutes, I said to the group, I think we should pray. And so we began to pray, and very shortly after we began, one young man prayed, God, let us release women into leadership. And I became so angry. I thought, what is this, a magic bullet? Releasing women into leadership is what is going to make everything better? Where is the broken heart in these men? Where is the repentant heart in these men after hearing what they have been hearing? Is this their only response? When the evening was over, I asked this young woman if I could meet her for coffee to hear a little more about her story and to encourage her. And so we met the next day. She brought a girlfriend with her who was bilingual, so we could talk. And we had a very good conversation. And in the middle of the conversation, she said, Darrow, will you give me a Western name? And I'd heard about this custom, but I had never been asked this before. And I was tremendously taken aback that she would ask me that, and honored that she would ask me that. But in many Asian societies, it's hard for Westerners to pronounce the names of a lot of Asians. And so Asians that are interacting with Westerners want a name that is more easily pronounced for a Westerner. So she asked the question, and it didn't take me but a second to answer her. And I looked at her and I said, you are Esther. You are Esther, because you stood up for your people. And I said, I want to be Mordecai. And it was at that moment that the book, Nurturing the Nations, was born. It took me 10 years to write it, but that's the moment the book was born. And it was born out of my own broken heart from hearing story after story from woman after woman around the world, and the brokenness of their hearts, the suffering of their hearts because of how they had been treated in their culture, by their culture and by the men in their culture. When I first went to Korea, the average Korean woman was having about 4 babies during her lifetime. This was 30 years ago. But something has happened in Korea in the last 30 years. Radical feminism has come to Korea. Radical feminism's ideas of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a mother. And this graphic is a very significant graphic to show what has happened in these last years in Korea. Korean women have gone from having 4 children to having 1 child. When a woman is only having 1 child, what does that mean in a culture? It means the culture is dying. Because every generation you have half the children. In 2 generations you have a quarter of the children that you had before. Korea today has, the average woman in Korea today has 1 child. When a nation only has, when the women in the nation only have 1.3 children, there's never been a nation in history that's recovered from that. It's the sign that the spiral downward of the nation and the culture is irreversible. So you go from the oppression on one side and you swing to the opposite side, where women no longer know what it means to be a mother. And a nation is literally committing cultural suicide. That's what this graphic explains. And we will be talking more about this in this series of lectures. I'd like to show us now a short 3-minute video. And a friend of mine produced this video. He's a filmmaker who for 20 or 30 years made films for institutions. And one day, the God of the universe spoke to him and said, I want you to make films that will impact history. And he made an hour and 15-minute documentary titled It's a Girl. And I want to show you the trailer for this documentary, because this is the reality of what is going on in the world today.
Today, India and China eliminate more girls than the number of girls born in America every year.
The definition of genocide is a systematic and methodical extermination of a certain group. And the gendercide is that systematic and methodical extermination of a gender group.
Why are Indian households secretly and brutally eliminating daughters from their family system?
They just wet the cloth and they fold it like this and they put it on the face so the child can't breathe. Immediately the child will die.
So 他当时就是用一个纸箱包着，其余多数是女人，因为他们一般情况下就是有超生的。
But what this is an entire system, a social machinery that says we don't want females.
But the real problem started after I became pregnant. They started asking me for a sex determination. They wanted to know if the children are girls or boys. They started torturing me to get an abortion done. What should I do to save my daughters?
कि उसके सिर हिला के देखा तो वो तो यहाँ पे गले पे पूरा निशान पड़ा हुआ है। निशान पड़ने के बाद तब हमें फिर रोना पीटना, हमारे तो होश ही उड़ गए थे लड़की को देख के कि इसने मार कैसे दी।
如果按计划生育生的话，我就只能生2个， 哎呀，反正他村子里都有专人搞这些工作的嘛，就被他们知道我们在那里。
மனசில் அதை வச்சிருக்கக்கூடாது, பையனாக இருந்தால் வச்சுக்கலாம், பெண்ணாக இருந்தால் ஒழிச்சுக்கலாம், அப்படி இப்படி பிடிச்சா தேர்ந்து போச்சு. பிறந்த உடனே நானே பாசிப்படுவேன். மறுபடி பையனே இல்லை அப்படின்னு 8 குழந்தைங்களாட்டம்லாம் கொண்டு விட்டோம்.
The 3 most dangerous words in the world. It's a girl. And this is one side of the spectrum, a sexist culture. This is how it sees women and how it treats women. And as we'll see this week, what radical feminism does, it moves from here to here. It doesn't solve the issues that we're dealing with. It just replaces one major problem for another major problem. One of my favorite authors on this subject is a woman named Lydia Signori. She's a maternal feminist, and we will be talking in this video series about 3 phases of feminism. The first wave, the second wave, and the third wave. And the first wave of feminism is maternal feminism. And Lydia Signori is a first wave feminist. And when I read her book years ago, I was absolutely shocked at her perspective. And I was shocked by the way she wrote things. She wrote absolutely in a beautiful way, using prose. And she said things that I had never heard before. But she used the ancient Greek Roman republics, and she uses this illustration. She says the ancient republics overlooked the value of the sex whose strength is in the heart. Greece failed in appreciating their excellence. And she takes a Corinthian column, part of Corinthian architecture, and she likens the column to brute strength. It is the column that holds up the roof of the building. And then on top of the column is the acanthusy leaf. I don't know as I'm sharing that correctly, but it's a decorative piece that's beautiful and fragile. And she says this: if in the brief season of a youthful charm she was constrained to admire women as the acanthus leaf of her own Corinthian capital, she did not discover how, like the very column, she was capable of adding stability to the proud temple of freedom. It takes male and female to produce a free society. And the brute strength of a male will not produce freedom. It takes male and female. And the glory of a person is not brute strength. You cannot compare female and determine a female's worth by brute strength. And that is what she was saying. And she continues, but still, wherever brute force of the warrior is counted godlike, woman is appreciated only as she approximates to the sterner natures. As long as the gods are brutes, As long as what's important is brute strength, women will fall short. And this is how the world functions. It looks at strength, brute strength, as what is godlike. And if you don't have brute strength, you have no worth. Our intention in this series of videos is to articulate the intrinsic dignity of both men and women. These videos are for male and female, for men and women, and to see that our dignity is inherent because we have been made in the very image of God. And our intention is to see that the importance of family, not families where men have abandoned the wife and the children, and not families that are broken where both parents have left and abandoned the children. It's to lay a theological foundation and a biblical worldview for the dignity of women and the importance of family. And it's also intended to raise up Esthers and Mordecais, men and women who will have a vision to speak about a comprehensive, holistic framework of what it means to be male and female.